For 3 years, Alpha King Ronan searched every wolf territory for his missing mate. He searched the mountains. He searched the forests. He searched the borders of every kingdom. But he never thought she would be hiding in the human city. Then, one rainy evening, Ronan walked into a tiny coffee shop. He wasn't looking for her. He only wanted shelter from the storm. But the moment the barista looked up from behind the counter, his entire world stopped. It was her. His missing mate, the woman every wolf in his kingdom believed was dead. She was standing there in a simple apron, serving coffee, as if she had never been a Luna, never lived in his palace, and never disappeared on the night of their mating ceremony. Ronan stared at her. Mara stared back. Then, instead of running into his arms, she calmly placed a cup of coffee on the counter. "Your order, sir." Ronan's eyes narrowed. She was pretending not to know him. But there was one question burning through his mind. Why had his mate abandoned the kingdom and hidden among humans for 3 years? The brass bell above the door chimed, and the heavy scent of wild pine and wet earth instantly murdered the smell of roasted espresso. Mara froze. Her hand stopped moving the damp rag across the granite counter. The air in the tiny shop suddenly grew entirely too thin. She did not need to turn around to see who had just walked out of the rainy street, because her inner wolf slammed against her ribs in instant recognition. She turned slowly. He filled the doorway. Alpha King Ronan stood dripping wet upon her cheap linoleum floor. He was massive. He was wild. He was entirely wrong for this small human world. He wore rough, dark leathers that clung to his wide chest. No armor, no modern coat. Just the primal clothes of a king who ruled by fang and claw. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. But his eyes were locked onto her with a hunger that made her knees weak. Following that heavy silence, the world seemed to stop spinning entirely. Mara remembered the night she fled. She remembered running through the freezing mud, her bare feet tearing on sharp rocks, the icy rain hiding her tears. She had run because the agonizing events following their mating ceremony were a poison in her blood. She had locked the horrifying fragments of that night in a dark box. Now, the box was breaking open. He took a slow step forward. His boots left wet tracks on the floor. He looked at her as if she were a ghost. He looked at her as if he had spent 1,000 nights digging up graves just to find her. The raw emotion on his face was a mystery she could not solve yet. Why did he look so deeply broken when he was the one who destroyed them? Because of this sudden shift, Mara forced her face to go completely blank. She built a wall of pure ice inside her mind. She would not cry. She would not scream. She would not shift into her wolf form and tear his throat out. She was Mara the barista now. She reached under the counter. She pulled out a white ceramic mug. Her hands shook, but she gripped the handle tight because she needed an anchor to reality. She set the mug down on the counter with a sharp, loud clack. Ronan stopped walking. His broad chest heaved. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stared at the apron tied around her waist. She looked him dead in the eye. The man who triggered her worst nightmare was finally here. "You're 3 years late," Mara said. Her voice was flat, cold, empty. The words hung in the air, building a bridge of pure ice right to the next terrifying moment. Building on that silent standoff, a low, rumbling growl vibrated in Ronan's chest. It was a sound that made the coffee cups rattle on their wooden shelves. The sound carried his alpha aura. It rolled across the room like a physical wave. The air grew impossibly heavy. It pressed down on Mara's shoulders, demanding that she bow her head. It demanded submission. Every instinct in her wolf blood screamed at her to drop to her knees and bare her neck to her king. She gripped the edge of the counter instead. Her knuckles turned stark white. She remembered a time a human customer had yelled at her because his latte was too cold. She had smiled, stayed calm, and handed him a new cup. She used that same numb human shield now. She would not bow. 3 years, Ronan choked out. His voice was raw, like he had swallowed broken glass. "We searched the borderlands. We dug through the snow. I thought you were dead, Mara." Despite his painful words, Mara felt a bitter fire burn in her chest. He was acting like the victim because he truly seemed to believe she was stolen from him. She spun around and grabbed the heavy metal portafilter. She slammed it into the espresso grinder. She kept her hands busy, because stopping meant feeling the full force of her breaking heart. I wasn't lost, she said to the wall. The grinder roared to life, drowning out the terrible silence. I knew exactly where I was. She tamped the coffee grounds down hard. She locked the handle into the machine. Dark, bitter liquid began to pour into the cup. She focused on the hot steam. She focused on the smell of the beans. She ignored the giant, lethal predator standing 3 feet away. She turned back around and slid the black coffee across the counter. It stopped right at the edge, inches from his large, scarred hand. Whatever you think you are here for, it is over, Mara said softly. It ended the night of our ceremony. Drink your coffee and leave. Ronan looked down at the small cup. He looked utterly lost. His huge hands twitched. And he did not touch the drink. I am not leaving, he whispered, his eyes flashing with sudden, feral gold. Not until I understand why my mate threw our kingdom away. His promise hung heavily in the steam between them, hooking directly into the long, agonizing days that were about to follow. Right after that first day, Mara realized the worst part was not his anger. It was his sadness. A week went by, and the ghost refused to vanish. Every morning, right at opening time, the bell chimed. Ronan walked in. He never ordered anything. He just walked to the small metal table in the far corner. The tiny chair groaned under his massive weight. He sat there for hours, a terrifying, primal beast trapped in a brightly lit human cage. He just watched her. But Mara knew an alpha could only stay still for so long before his instincts demanded action. He watched her wipe tables, take orders, and smile at strangers. His eyes tracked her every move. She could feel his gaze burning through her clothes. It made her skin prickle. It made a dangerous, unwanted heat twist low in her belly. She hated it. She hated that her wolf still wanted him. She tried to push him out of her mind, but the silence in the cafe was too loud whenever he was there. She remembered how they used to run through the forest together before the mating ceremony. They used to race under the moonlight, completely wild and completely free. She missed the forest. She missed the wind. She missed the freedom. She gripped a dirty rag and scrubbed a table so hard her arm ached. The cafe finally emptied out. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Suddenly, the metal chair scraped loudly against the floor. Mara jumped. She turned around. Ronan was standing up, and his patience had clearly run out. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped right in front of her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She could smell the rain in his hair. He reached out. His large hand hovered just an inch from her cheek, but he did not touch her. His fingers trembled slightly. I am going mad, Mara, he said in a low, desperate whisper. You look at me with such hate. You act like I am a monster. Tell me, please, what happened that night? Mara stopped breathing. She stared into his eyes. There was no lie there. There was only deep, agonizing confusion. A cold chill ran down her spine. Who had woven the shadows that night? What reality was he living in? She stepped back, putting space between them, because she could not think when he was this close. She clutched the damp rag to her chest. Do you really not remember? She asked, her voice cracking for the first time in 3 years. Following that heavy, desperate plea, the silence in the coffee shop turned entirely deafening. The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Do you really not remember? Ronan's golden eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. He looked genuinely terrified by her trembling words. Mara's chest tightened painfully under her dark apron. She had to say it. She had to rip the terrible bandage off because keeping the poison inside was actively killing her wolf. I came looking for you after the mating ceremony, Mara whispered. Her voice shook, rattling in her tight throat like dry leaves. The moon was high. The celebration fires were burning low. I walked into the royal tent to find my mate. She paused, swallowing a jagged lump of grief. And I saw you. Ronan stepped closer, his dark brow furrowing in deep confusion. Saw me what? Mara, I was sleeping. I woke up alone. I thought you had been snatched in the night. You were not sleeping, she snapped. Her calm human mask finally cracked. A raw, guttural snarl ripped through her lips. You were with her, tangled in the heavy furs. I saw the betrayal. I smelled the deceit. I ran away forever. Recoiling as if struck by a physical blow, the massive alpha stumbled backward against a small wooden table, the color completely drained from his rugged, weather-beaten face. No, he breathed out, violently shaking his head. No, Mara, that is absolutely impossible. It is the truth, she cried out. I was drunk, he rasped. His voice broke into a pathetic, hollow sound. He dragged his large hands through his wet hair, his eyes darting frantically as he furiously searched his own mind. The elders kept pouring the fermented mead, but it was more than that. My memories are fragmented, smashed into pieces. I remember stumbling into the dark tent. I remember someone pulling me down into the furs. But her face, he choked on the words, a flash of pure horror crossing his features. I couldn't see her face. My head was spinning violently. The scent was completely confusing, completely wrong, but my mind kept telling me it was you. I swear on my inner wolf, I believed she was you. Suddenly, the entire world tilted off its axis. Mara grabbed the edge of the granite counter because her knees completely gave way beneath her. Her reality shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces on the floor. He did not know. He never knowingly chose another female over her, but his fragmented memory raised a terrifying, dark new shadow. Was he merely blackout drunk, or had someone deliberately altered his primal senses to mask their true identity? 3 years of intense agony had been built on a single night neither of them remembered the same way. But one terrible, haunting question remained. If Ronan truly believed that woman was his mate, who had entered their tent wearing another female's scent. He took a shaky, uneven breath, looking at her with completely shattered eyes, plunging them right into a very confusing and fragile truce. Emerging from that earth-shattering revelation, a very strange, awkward dynamic settled over the tiny apartment above the shop. Ronan did not order her to pack her bags. Instead, he stubbornly tried to fit his massive, feral body into her delicate human world. He wanted to prove his devotion. He wanted to earn her back, inch by tiny inch. A leaky pipe under her kitchen sink became his first ridiculous, completely unnecessary battleground. Pass the metal wrench, Ronan grunted softly. He was awkwardly wedged under her cheap wooden cabinet. His massive, muscular shoulders barely fit in the tiny, cramped space beneath the sink. Mara knelt on the cool linoleum floor and handed him the heavy metal tool. She watched his thick back muscles flex beautifully against his tight shirt. She remembered the blistering heat of his skin from years ago. She remembered his unexpectedly gentle touch. Her breath hitched quietly in her throat. She quickly looked away, because the terrifying urge to reach out and touch his dark hair was growing entirely too strong. A loud, violent crack suddenly echoed in the small kitchen. Ah! Ronan roared. He tried to stand up too fast, and his hard, stubborn head slammed directly into the wooden counter. The cheap wood splintered instantly under his alpha strength. A massive geyser of freezing water blasted out from the broken, twisted pipe. It soaked his dark hair, his rough clothes, and the entire kitchen floor in mere seconds. The terrifying Alpha King, a brutal man who crushed rogue wolves with his bare hands, was completely defeated by basic human plumbing. Mara gasped. Then, something entirely unexpected happened in the freezing spray. A bubble of sound escaped her tight throat. A laugh. It started as a tiny, hesitant giggle, but soon she was laughing so hard her ribs actually ached. Ronan glared at her, dripping wet like a massive, angry hound. But as he watched her laugh, the fierce anger melted away. A slow, breathtakingly handsome smile spread across his rugged face. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated warmly in the small room. He carefully reached out his large, wet hand to help her stand up from the flooding floor. Mara instinctively reached back, but the old linoleum was incredibly slick with cold water. As she pulled herself up, her bare foot completely slipped out from under her. She pitched forward with a sharp, surprised gasp. Ronan caught her waist instantly to stop her fall, but the sudden momentum sent them both crashing backward onto the soaked floor. Suddenly, they were tangled together. His heavy, powerful chest pressed gently against hers. The laughter instantly died in her throat. His golden eyes locked fiercely onto her wide brown ones. The air turned incredibly heavy and dangerously electric. She could feel his wild, racing heartbeat pressing right against her chest. She wanted to kiss him, She wanted to pull his wet, handsome face down to hers. But she turned her face away at the last second, because the deep, paralyzing fear of trusting him again was still a massive wall in her mind. Ronan let out a ragged, heavy sigh. He slowly pulled back, giving her the careful space she needed, leaving a simmering fire burning hot in the damp room. That simmering tension was violently interrupted 2 days later by a terrifying reminder of the brutal world they had left behind. Mara was slowly wiping down the cafe tables when the front glass door burst wide open. A huge, deeply scarred man marched inside. He smelled heavily like ancient earth, dried blood, and severe panic. It was Kale, Ronan's lead warrior, trapped in an incredibly uncomfortable human jacket that stretched tightly across his massive back. "My king," Kale growled softly, bowing his large head respectfully. "The western packs are growing restless. The stronghold is completely vulnerable without you. You must return to the forest tonight." Ronan's strong, square jaw locked tight. The playful, gentle male from the apartment vanished in a terrifying instant. The ruthless, commanding Alpha King fully returned. His aura flared, hot and demanding in the small room. He looked at his loyal warrior, and then he slowly turned to look at Mara. Mara felt a cold rock drop heavily into her stomach. He was leaving her again. Ronan walked slowly up to her counter. He did not use his crushing alpha command. He did not grab her arm to forcefully drag her away. "I cannot stay here," Ronan said softly, his deep voice full of thick, choking sorrow. "My people need their king, but I will not force you to come with me. I stole your choice 3 years ago, because of my stupid, blind mistake. I will absolutely not steal your choice again." He turned his incredibly broad back to her. He walked slowly toward the glass door. Every heavy step he took felt like a giant, invisible hammer hitting her fragile chest. Mara looked frantically around the quiet coffee shop. She looked at the expensive espresso machine. She looked at the clean, safe, boring white walls. She had built this cozy place to hide. She hid her wolf. She hid her broken heart. She hid her true destiny. But looking at it now, this cafe was not a sanctuary anymore. It was a suffocating cage. Would the wild, feral pack ever accept a human-smelling Luna back into their brutal ranks? She did not know, but she knew she had to try. "Wait!" Mara shouted loudly. Ronan stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his dark head. "Give me 10 minutes to pack a bag," she said, her voice shaking, but finally ringing with certainty. She made her final choice, because she realized a quiet life without him was vastly worse than the terrifying risk of facing the truth. 2 hours later, they stood together at the very edge of the sprawling human city. The dark, ancient trees of the wolf territories loomed ahead like sleeping giants. The bright, modern world faded away into nothing behind them. There were no streetlights here. There were only deep shadows, wild beasts, and brutal pack laws that ruled entirely by raw strength. Mara took a deep, shaky breath. She let the sharp smell of wild pine fill her lungs. She stepped across the invisible border, leaving her safe human life behind forever to reclaim her stolen throne. The dark, ancient forest swallowed them completely as they walked. The air grew incredibly thick. The heavy scent of damp earth, wet pine needles, and wood smoke replaced the clean smell of city rain. Soon, the great, jagged stone walls of the Alpha King's stronghold broke through the towering trees. There were no paved roads here. There were absolutely no electric streetlights. Only the wild, flickering orange glow of massive fire pits lit up the muddy courtyard. Hundreds of massive wolves waited in the dark shadows. As Ronan stepped firmly into the firelight, a deafening, bone-shaking chorus of howls ripped through the cold night. The wild pack was passionately welcoming their fierce king. But the very second Mara stepped out from behind his massive, protective shadow, the howling stopped instantly. A suffocating, heavy silence crashed violently over the large courtyard. Golden and amber eyes flashed brightly in the dark, locking onto her fragile frame. She could actually feel them aggressively tasting the air. They smelled the roasted espresso. They smelled the sweet city soap. They knew exactly who she was. Their lost Luna, a true wolf of the royal bloodline. But they were deeply confused by her scent. Why did she carry herself like a human? Where was the wild fire in her blood? Her inner wolf whined loudly in her mind, desperately wanting to break free. It wanted to roar and prove she was still a fierce predator. But Mara forced her spine incredibly straight. She kept her chin high because showing any wild, out-of-control emotion to a feral pack meant instant weakness. She quickly pulled up the exact same icy, blank wall she used to handle chaos in the human city. She made her face a completely blank, unreadable mask. Ronan placed a heavy, intensely warm hand on her lower back. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated deep in his chest, silently warning the curious crowd to back away. The large wolves parted like a dark sea, respectfully lowering their massive heads to him. But Mara still heard the cruel, honest whispers. "She smells like dead concrete." An old gray-furred elder muttered softly from the shadows. "What happened to her?" Another large female growled quietly. "She walks like prey." The human world made our Luna incredibly soft. Mara's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. The wild, burning urge to shift, to let her hidden silver fur burst violently from her skin, was incredibly strong, but she firmly held it back. She needed to observe the pack dynamics carefully first. She needed to quickly find out who still loved her and who thought she was a broken mistake. She walked closely beside Ronan, up the grand, sweeping stone steps to the royal den. Her bare feet felt the freezing, hard rock beneath her. Every single step was a heavy, terrifying reminder of what she had to figure out. Could she ever become the wild Luna again? Did she even want to? She was completely surrounded by massive, primal killers, and her only shield was the cold, calculating mind she had forged in exile. The next evening, the great hall was packed tightly with hungry, roaring wolves. The loud, chaotic setting was purely medieval and incredibly savage. Massive, rough-hewn wooden tables groaned heavily under the weight of freshly hunted deer and wild boar. There were no delicate silver forks or clean ceramic plates here. The wild pack tore viciously into the bleeding meat with bare hands and sharp, gleaming teeth. Mara sat incredibly stiffly at the high stone table right beside Ronan. The raw, heavy metallic smell of fresh blood made her stomach churn violently. Suddenly, a massive, heavily scarred female slammed her bloody hands down on the wood right in front of Mara. Her name was Vanya, a brutal, terrifying hunter. "You walk like a frightened rabbit," Vanya snarled loudly. Her bright yellow eyes blazed with deadly, open challenge. "Give up the high seat, or I will violently take it from you down in the dirt." The entire noisy hall went completely, terrifyingly silent. Every single wolf stopped chewing their meat. They waited eagerly for Mara to shift. They waited for the queen to answer the physical challenge. Ronan stiffened quickly beside her. A dangerous, lethal rumble started deep in his chest. But Mara did not look at him for help. She had to fight her own battles. Mara did not shift into her wolf. She slowly picked up a carved wooden cup. She looked up at Vanya with a dead, emotionless stare. "You are incredibly loud," Mara said quietly. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "But your left leg slightly favors your right. I saw you limp badly when you walked in. You deeply tore a muscle on the hunt." Vanya let out a harsh, barking laugh. A cruel smirk twisted her scarred lips. "You noticed my limp. Congratulations, little human thinker. But what happens when I challenge you with a leg that isn't injured? What happens when I am fully healed and I come for your throat?" The pack murmured loudly. Vanya had outsmarted her threat. Mara's heart hammered painfully against her ribs, but her face never changed. "When you heal, you still won't challenge me," Mara replied softly, leaning in just a tiny inch. Vanya narrowed her glowing eyes. "Why?" "Because your limp is not your real problem," Mara stated clearly, making sure the nearby elders heard every word. "You are absolutely terrified the younger hunters see you slowing down. You challenged me tonight, the Broken Queen, because you desperately need a fast, easy win to keep your high rank. You are trying to use me to hide your own fading strength from the pack." Vanya's rugged face drained entirely of color. She took a slow, very unsteady step backward. Mara had not used claws or fangs. Instead, she used her sharp observation to completely strip away Vanya's fierce mask. She exposed the hunter's deepest secret to the entire room. The sheer, chilling logic of Mara's quiet takedown was vastly more terrifying than a mindless snarl. The large female bowed her head slightly and backed away quickly into the quiet crowd. Mara won the room without spilling a single drop of blood. Later that night, The heavy wooden doors of the royal den finally closed shut, totally blocking out the wild pack. The large, circular stone room was warmly lit by a massive, crackling fire in the hearth. Mara let out an incredibly long, deeply exhausted breath. She sat down heavily on the edge of the huge bed covered in thick, dark bear furs. Her entire body ached painfully from the intense, non-stop tension of the day. Ronan walked over holding a small clay bowl of crushed, strong-smelling healing herbs. His heavy leather boots made soft, rhythmic thuds on the cold stone floor. He knelt gently on the ground right in front of her. To the entire kingdom, he was a ruthless, terrifying beast. But here, in the quiet dark, the Alpha King was as gentle as a soft summer breeze. "You scraped your arm on the stone wall today," he murmured softly. Mara looked down in surprise. There was a long, thin red scratch near her elbow. Ronan dipped his large, calloused fingers into the green herbal paste. He gently, slowly spread it over her torn skin. His touch was incredibly warm, so incredibly careful. A wonderful, electric shiver ran straight up her spine. He looked up, his bright golden eyes glowing beautifully in the warm firelight. "You completely dismantled Vanya," he whispered smoothly. "You fought exactly like a true queen. But you refused to let your wolf out. You used human tricks." "Cold words are my only armor right now," she replied softly, sadly looking away from his intense gaze. "My wolf is still hiding. I am absolutely terrified to let her out. What if she is totally different now?" "You are not the same female who left 3 years ago," Ronan said fiercely, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority. He reached up and gently cupped her soft cheek. "And I do not want you to be. The human world changed you. It made you incredibly sharp. I will wait as long as it takes for your wolf to wake up." Mara looked back into his honest eyes. The fierce protective instinct radiating from him was a heavy, totally intoxicating blanket. She slowly, carefully leaned into his warm hand. She felt safe. For the first time in 3 incredibly long years, she felt truly safe in his massive arms. He leaned in closer. His hot breath gently brushed across her lips. The simmering, romantic fire between them flared into a bright, desperate need. Suddenly, heavy fists pounded violently against the thick wooden door. "Alpha King!" A panicked guard roared loudly from the hallway. "Come quickly! It is the winter food stores." Ronan ripped himself away, his handsome face twisting instantly into an angry, terrifying snarl. The eastern caves collapsed. The guard shouted through the heavy wood. "Half of our winter meat is buried under tons of rock. The pack will completely starve before the snow melts." Ronan cursed loudly, his massive hands balling into fists. He knew how to hunt, and he knew how to kill. But rationing food for hundreds of starving wolves required a totally different kind of mind. Mara slowly stood up from the bed. Her eyes narrowed in deep thought. She knew inventory. She knew exactly how to stretch supplies to survive a long, bitter winter. The kingdom was in terrible danger, and her human skills were suddenly the only thing that could save them. The morning air was absolutely freezing, thick with the sharp, choking scent of crushed rock dust and buried meat. Mara stood carefully near the jagged, terrifying mouth of the collapsed eastern caves. She held a flat piece of pale birch bark and a stick of blackened charcoal. Massive, heavily muscled wolves in their human forms grunted and strained all around her. They were desperately hauling giant, heavy boulders away from the rubble. Ronan was right at the very front of the line. His massive back flexed, sweat glistening hotly on his skin despite the bitter cold as he single-handedly hurled a massive slab of limestone aside. He was raw, terrifying alpha power, but brute strength could not unrot meat. "Stop digging," Mara commanded clearly, her voice cutting sharply through the loud scraping of stone. The workers paused, panting heavily. They looked at her with a mix of deep confusion and primal annoyance. A large, grizzled tracker named Thorn stepped forward, wiping dirty rock dust from his wide snout. "My queen," Thorn growled softly, though his deep tone lacked true respect. "The meat is buried deeply. We must dig it all out before the winter rot sets in." "The rot is already spreading," Mara replied smoothly, stepping forward carefully over the loose, dangerous stones. "I can smell the heavy decay underneath the limestone. Because I ran a coffee shop on a razor-thin margin for 3 years, I know exactly how to manage supplies. If you keep moving the supporting rocks, The rest of the ceiling will completely collapse. It will crush the good meat in the lower chamber. Thorn narrowed his dark eyes. Wolves hunt. We do not hoard food like weak, fearful humans. We will simply run the borders and kill more deer. The herds have already migrated south for the brutal winter, Mara countered calmly, holding up her charcoal bark. She had spent the last 3 hours calculating every single pound of edible meat. If we hunt now, we burn precious energy chasing empty snow. We will ration what is safely in the lower chamber. We cut the daily portions by 1/4. We prioritize the pregnant females and the fighting guards. The rest of us will endure the hunger together. A low, collective rumble of intense displeasure rippled through the freezing workers. Ronan turned around. He wiped the dirt from his rugged jaw and looked at his mate. He did not question her logic. He did not undermine her authority in front of the pack. He simply projected his crushing alpha aura over the grumbling crowd, silencing them instantly. "You heard your Luna," Ronan commanded fiercely. "Seal the upper cave. Begin the rationing immediately." Mara let out a slow, quiet breath of deep relief. She had done it. She had used her unique human intellect to solve a brutal pack problem, and her king had backed her completely. Then, a long, haunting howl ripped through the distant tree line. The reaction was instant and deeply terrifying. Every single wolf froze completely still. The heavy rocks dropped loudly from their hands. Ronan's golden eyes widened in pure, unfiltered shock. Mara felt a terrible, cold chill run down her spine. "What is it?" she whispered. Because the silence was so sudden and heavy, she could hear the distant crunch of footsteps in the snow. No one answered her question. Ronan just stared blankly at the main gates. A deep sense of dread settled heavily in Mara's stomach as she followed him back to the stronghold, totally unprepared for the nightmare walking out of the dark trees. Following that chilling, haunting silence, the massive stone courtyard filled rapidly with tense, whispering wolves. Mara stood rigidly on the high wooden platform beside Ronan. The bitter winter wind whipped her dark hair violently across her face. The heavy wooden gates slowly groaned open, revealing the dark, shadowy forest beyond. A lone female walked slowly through the gates. As she stepped into the flickering orange light of the fire pits, the air completely rushed out of Mara's tight lungs. It was her. It was the beautiful, dark-haired female from the royal tent 3 years ago. Her name was Lyra. But Lyra did not strut like a proud, arrogant conqueror. She walked slowly, her head bowed in deep, tragic sorrow. She wore ragged, dirty furs, and her hands wrapped protectively over the unmistakable, totally rounded swell of her pregnant belly. She looked like a desperate, broken victim. Lyra stopped right at the base of the platform. Tears shined brightly in her large eyes. "I beg for sanctuary," Lyra called out softly, her voice trembling with perfectly acted fear. "I did not come here to challenge your queen. I came because I have nowhere else to take the king's children." The entire courtyard erupted in loud, shocked gasps. Ronan stiffened violently beside Mara. A terrifying, murderous rumble shook his massive chest. "Liar!" he roared violently, his eyes flashing pure, lethal gold. "I have never touched you!" Lyra flinched backward, looking totally terrified and deeply heartbroken. "You touched me in the dark tent," she wept quietly, speaking just loud enough for the surrounding elders to hear every single word. "You were completely drunk on fermented mead. You pulled me down into the heavy bear furs, and you whispered that I smelled exactly like wild pine and rain. I thought you wanted me. I thought I was chosen." Mara stopped breathing. The world spun violently around her. Those were the exact details she had witnessed before she fled. Lyra wasn't just lying. She was using the fragmented, horrific truth to forge an unbreakable trap. And because Lyra was playing the innocent, tragic victim, she was totally believable. The elders began to murmur sympathetically. Some looked at Lyra with deep, genuine pity. Others looked at Ronan with heavy, accusing doubt. The court was completely split in half. Lyra had planted a brilliant, poisonous seed of doubt, using the exact memories that haunted them both. Mara did not scream. She did not cry. She did not shift into her wolf. She simply turned on her heel and walked blindly away from the chaotic courtyard, her vision completely tunneling into total darkness. Mara slammed the heavy oak door of the royal den shut. She backed away rapidly from the wood, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Her lungs burned for air. The terrible stone walls of the room seemed to be closing in on her. Her inner wolf was screaming in pure, blinding agony. The absolute worst nightmare had completely returned. Lyra was using the exact same memories, the exact same night, to destroy them all over again. Bam! The thick wooden door violently burst open. Ronan stood in the doorway, breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. His alpha aura was totally frantic, suffocating the room with the scent of wild, desperate panic. He stepped quickly toward her, reaching out his large, trembling hands to grab her. "Don't!" Mara cried out, backing up until her spine hit the freezing cold stone wall. "Do not touch me." Ronan froze instantly. His massive hands stopped mere inches from her trembling shoulders. He looked at her terrified, tear-stained face, and a sudden, heartbreaking realization visibly washed over him. 3 years ago, his actions drove her away in the dark. If he forced his heavy touch on her now, if he used his crushing alpha authority to hold her here, he was just a monster repeating the exact same mistake. He slowly, painfully lowered his thick arms. He took a deliberate, respectful step backward, giving her the space she desperately needed. "I will not trap you, Mara," Ronan said softly, his deep voice thick with raw, bleeding emotion. "But those pups are not mine, and I will prove it." Mara stared at him. Her core flaw screamed at her to pack a bag. The open door was right there. She could run back to the human city. She could hide behind her espresso machine and never feel this agonizing, suffocating pain again. But as she looked at Ronan standing respectfully away from her, giving her a real choice, something fundamental shifted inside her chest. 3 years ago, she saw a betrayal and ran away without asking a single question. She had let pure fear dictate her entire reality. She looked at the empty travel bag sitting in the corner of the room. She looked back at the king who refused to cage her. "I am not running," Mara whispered. Her brown eyes slowly steadied, the blind panic fading into a cold, hard focus. Ronan let out a shaky, desperate breath. "You're staying?" "I am not packing a bag," Mara said clearly, her voice growing stronger with every single word. "I ran away from the shadows once, and it cost us 3 years. I won't do it again. I don't know exactly what happened in that dark tent, Ronan, but we are going to stay right here, and we are going to find the truth together." Following that quiet declaration of war, Mara refused to sit like a helpless prize in the royal den. She walked into the cold morning mist with her chin held high. She did not carry weapons. She did not bare her fangs. She did not roar for dominance. But she carried something the feral wolves had never encountered before, the cold, methodical mind of an investigator. Because she had survived 3 years balancing ledgers and reading deceptive human customers, she knew exactly how to spot a liar. She marched directly toward the old guard posts near the edge of the royal clearing. The air smelled of damp moss, burning pine resin, and the sharp tang of fresh frost. "Who stood watch at the ceremonial pavilion 3 years ago?" Mara asked quietly. 2 large warrior sentries shifted uncomfortably on their heavy feet. They looked down at her simple linen tunic. "Old Bran stood the western post," the taller sentry grunted softly, avoiding her gaze. "But he does not speak of that night." "He will speak to me," Mara replied smoothly. Before she could take another step toward the northern trail, a soft, confident voice echoed from the wooden walkway above. "Are you hunting down my witnesses already, my queen?" Mara turned slowly. Lyra stood wrapped in thick white rabbit furs. She was not crying. She was not playing the broken, terrified victim right now, because there were no elders around to watch her perform. Instead, a terrifying, smug smile rested easily on her lips. "I am simply looking for the truth," Mara said calmly. "Then, investigate, my queen," Lyra purred smoothly, walking slowly down the wooden steps. "Ask every guard, ask every elder, ask anyone who remembers that night. Turn over every single stone you can find." Mara narrowed her eyes. A cold chill ran down her spine. Why was Lyra so incredibly confident? If Lyra was lying about the pups, a thorough investigation should deeply terrify her. Because Lyra was actively welcoming the hunt, Mara realized the trap was completely airtight. Lyra had perfectly covered every possible angle to make her lie look exactly like the truth. "I am going to bring every shadow of that night into the blazing light," Mara stated coldly. Lyra just smiled wider, leaving Mara with a deep, unsettling feeling. as the sun rose higher in the freezing sky. Emerging into the deep, frosted woods behind the fortress, Mara desperately needed to breathe. The heavy stone walls had felt like a suffocating trap. Here, beneath the giant, ancient pines, the crisp mountain wind bit into her bare skin, clearing her troubled mind. A sudden rustle of dry brush made her whip around. Ronan stood 10 paces away. He wore rough leather breeches, his massive chest bare to the bitter winter chill. Steam rose from his broad shoulders. He did not say a single word. He simply dropped into a low, predatory crouch, his amber eyes blazing with a fierce, challenging fire. He knew exactly what she needed. She did not need another heavy, exhausting conversation. Because her wolf was restless and angry, she needed to let the wild energy out. Mara did not hesitate. A wild thrill surged through her veins. She lunged forward on bare feet. She feinted left, aiming for his ribs, but Ronan caught her wrist. She twisted sharply. She used his own massive weight against him, sweeping his leg. They tumbled hard into a deep, powdery snowbank. They did not use magic. They did not fight to kill. They fought like two wild wolves blowing off steam. She got clever. He got stronger. She surprised him with a fast elbow. He laughed out loud, a rich, booming sound that echoed warmly through the dark trees. Finally, they lay flat on their backs in the freezing snow. They were completely exhausted, panting heavily, and staring up at the gray winter sky. "I missed this," Ronan breathed out. "I missed us." Mara turned her head to look at him. His dark hair was heavily dusted with white snow. "The elders are calling a council tonight," Ronan said softly, the playful spark fading entirely from his eyes. "If they demand my crown because I refuse to claim her lie, I will gladly drop it in the dirt." Mara reached out and grabbed his large, cold hand. She squeezed it fiercely. "Do not dare lose your crown for me," Mara said firmly. "You are the Alpha King. We are not running away. We are going to solve this together." Ronan squeezed her hand back, nodding slowly, as they prepared to face the heavy judgment of the entire pack. Because the heavy war drums began to pound at sunset, that fragile peace in the forest was brutally ripped away. The rhythmic vibrations shook the very foundations of the great council hall. Mara walked beside Ronan into the massive stone chamber. Iron braziers roared with high flames. Every single elder, pack tracker, and ranking warrior stood packed in the stands. This was not a trial of villains plotting an evil takeover. This was a genuine, terrifying succession crisis. Because the bloodline of the Alpha King was the most important thing to the pack's survival, the kingdom desperately needed to know what to do with these unborn pups. Lyra sat on a carved wooden bench in the center of the pit. Beside her stood an old, heavily scarred wolf with a milky, blind left eye. Old Bran. Elder Kenneth struck the stone floor with his heavy staff. "A claimant stands before the ancestors. We must hear the truth to protect the royal bloodline." "Speak, Bran." The old guard stepped forward, his voice trembling under the heavy weight of the room. 3 years ago, I stood the western post. I saw King Ronan stumble into the royal tent. He was heavily intoxicated. He could barely walk straight. The hall went totally silent. "Did anyone else enter the tent?" Kenneth asked loudly. "No," Bran replied honestly. "I saw nobody else enter afterward. But before the dawn broke, I saw Lyra leave the royal tent, and she was carrying the king's scent heavy upon her neck." A collective gasp erupted from the gathered wolves. The evidence was completely ambiguous, but it was incredibly damaging. Bran did not see them physically together, but he saw Ronan enter drunk, and he saw Lyra leave, smelling exactly like him. "It is a trick," Ronan roared, stepping forward angrily. "I drank entirely too much mead. I stumbled into the dark, but I swear to you, I never knowingly touched her." Mara felt the cold weight of the entire kingdom pressing down upon her shoulders. She was completely trapped. She knew Lyra was in that tent because she had seen it with her own 2 eyes. But she also knew Ronan's desperate, honest version. The elders were whispering rapidly, fiercely trying to interpret the fragmented clues. Mara looked at Lyra's smug face, and then down at old Bran. For 3 years, she had believed exactly what her eyes showed her. She had let a single visual moment destroy her entire life. She would not make that mistake again. Because words and testimonies could be so easily manipulated, human logic and quiet arguments were no longer enough to save them. She did not need another witness. She needed absolute, undeniable proof. In the direct aftermath of Old Brand's devastating testimony, the great hall plunged into a tense, heavy murmur. The elders did not shout or immediately banish anyone. They huddled together in the flickering firelight, their old faces grim with the heavy burden of ancient pack law. Elder Kenneth finally stepped forward. He struck his heavy wooden staff against the solid rock floor. The loud crack echoed like sudden thunder, silencing the divided crowd. "The law of the ancestors is absolute," Kenneth announced, his voice carrying a deep, reluctant sorrow. "Because ancient pack law strictly protects unborn royal pups, we cannot ignore this claim. Until the pups are born and their blood can be tested in the dirt, Lyra is granted temporary sanctuary. Mara's position as Luna is temporarily suspended. She will be moved to the lower dens while the investigation continues." Mara felt the cold air rush out of her lungs, but she kept her chin high. Ronan erupted with pure, terrifying fury. A violent, earth-shaking snarl ripped from his chest. His massive muscles strained, and his claws tore deep gashes into the solid stone floor. He was a split second away from tearing the hall apart, but he didn't. He looked at the frightened elders. He looked at the divided warriors. Because starting a bloody civil war would completely destroy the innocent pack, Ronan forced his savage wolf down. His massive chest heaved with heavy pants. He pulled his deadly aura back in. That incredible restraint was a totally different kind of alpha power. He did not yield, but he chose to protect his people over his pride. He locked his blazing golden eyes with Mara. They shared a quiet, powerful look of complete understanding. Lyra smiled a tiny, tragic smile. She bowed her head humbly, surrounded by a heavy wall of protective guards who escorted her toward the warm upper dens. But as she walked past, Mara suddenly caught a very strange, bitter scent, completely hidden beneath Lyra's sweet perfume. It smelled sharp and entirely wrong. This temporary demotion pushed Mara straight into the damp shadows, but it also gave her the perfect, quiet space to finally think. Moving into the damp shadows of the lower caves, Mara did not let the cold stone break her spirit. Her new room was tiny and smelled heavily of old earth. She sat quietly on the thin blanket, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. She was not defeated. Her mind was racing. She thought deeply about her difficult days in the human city. She vividly remembered a rude man who came into her cafe claiming there was a dead bug in his coffee. He demanded free food, but he completely refused to hand the cup over the counter. Because the scammer refused to let her actually look inside the cup, Mara instantly knew he was lying. Liars always desperately control what other people are allowed to verify. Suddenly, a bright spark lit up in Mara's mind. Why did Lyra absolutely refuse to let the old pack healers closely examine her swollen belly? Lyra claimed she was just frightened, but maybe she was actually hiding something physical. Mara realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. She was trying to prove the pups weren't Ronan's, but maybe she needed to investigate the pregnancy itself. She walked slowly out into the freezing courtyard to clear her head. The pack's reaction to her was completely mixed. Some wolves whispered quietly. Some looked away in deep pity. Some were just terribly confused, totally unsure of who to believe. As she walked near the food stores, she saw Thorn. The grumpy, grizzled tracker did not speak to her. He did not bow. But as he walked past her cold cave a few minutes later, he stopped for just 1 second. He quietly placed a large, warm piece of freshly roasted meat on a flat stone right outside her door. He walked away without looking back. It was a tiny, silent message. Not everyone had abandoned her. This quiet show of deep loyalty fueled the burning fire she needed to face the longest, coldest night of her entire life. Following that quiet show of support, Mara still felt the heavy weight of the terrifying unknown, pulling her toward the forest edge. She walked slowly past the sleeping sentries in the dead of night. She walked to the very edge of the dark, ancient trees. The freezing winter wind bit harshly into her bare skin. She looked out through the dark pines. Far away, she could barely see the faint, glowing yellow lights of the human city shining in the dark. The temptation to leave was a heavy physical ache in her chest. She could easily just walk away right now. She could go back to the safe, boring coffee shop. She could leave the brutal politics, the painful lies, and the freezing cold completely behind her. She remembered her very first night in that bright city 3 years ago. She had cried entirely alone on a hard mattress. She had run away because she trusted exactly what her eyes had seen in the dark tent. She almost took a step toward the city lights. But she didn't run. Because running away only created more painful ghosts, she forced her bare feet to plant firmly in the snow. She would not run from the shadows. She would not hide in the city. She would not abandon her king to a clever liar. 3 years ago, her response to betrayal was to flee without asking a single question. Now, her response was to stay. She thought about Lyra's strange, bitter scent. She thought about Lyra dodging the pack healers. Lyra wasn't afraid of being accused in the Great Hall. Lyra was terrified of being physically examined in the light. Mara did not suddenly unlock a magical wolf power. She didn't need to. She had something completely different, and incredibly dangerous. She knew how to notice exactly what everyone else overlooked. She finally knew exactly how to break the trap. Mara turned her back to the safe city lights. She looked at the massive, dark stronghold of her wild kingdom. She was going to demand a physical examination, and she was going to use the pack's own strict laws to force Lyra into the blazing light. Stepping away from the frozen forest border, Mara walked back to the stone stronghold with fierce new purpose. The heavy, paralyzing weight of fear was completely gone from her chest. She marched straight toward the lower training pits, her bare feet crunching loudly in the fresh snow. She found Ronan exactly where she expected him to be. He was violently punching a thick, scarred wooden post. He wore no shirt in the freezing wind. His massive back muscles flexed tightly, and his raw knuckles were bleeding down his fingers. Because his massive frustration was boiling over into dangerous rage, he desperately needed a physical target to destroy. Mara walked right up to him. She did not flinch away from his wild, angry energy. She grabbed his thick, sweaty forearm, stopping his heavy punch in midair. He spun around, his golden eyes blazing with feral fire. She did not need sharp fangs. She did not need thick fur. She did not need physical dominance to win this war. She had a brilliant plan. "I know exactly how to break her lie," Mara said quietly, her voice entirely steady. Ronan breathed heavily, his warm breath turning to thick white steam in the bitter air. He looked down at her, the wild anger slowly fading into deep, desperate hope. How? Mara thought back to her 3 years behind the counter of her cafe. She didn't remember one specific scammer, but she remembered the golden rule of human deception. People who were telling the truth usually wanted their problems closely examined. They begged you to look. But people who were protecting a dirty lie always tried to carefully control the examination. They kept you away from the evidence. She looked up into Ronan's waiting eyes. "Lyra plays the terrified victim," Mara explained smoothly, her sharp mind connecting all the invisible dots. "She claims she needs absolute protection, but she completely refuses to let anyone actually look closely at her belly. Liars isolate the truth." Ronan frowned, wiping a drop of sweat from his strong jaw. "The elders will not let me force her into a medical exam. Pack law strictly protects a pregnant female from any physical distress." "Exactly," Mara nodded, stepping closer until her warm chest brushed against his cold skin. "Because the pack elders value ancient law above all else, we are going to use their own sacred rules against them. We will not attack her. We will honor her." Ronan's golden eyes widened. He suddenly realized the brilliant, terrifying simplicity of her human logic. If Lyra truly carried the future heirs of the kingdom, the pack's oldest laws demanded a highly specific, sacred medical blessing from the High Healer. By demanding the highest honor for her, they would completely trap Lyra in the blazing light. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle of pure awe. He pulled her close, kissing her cold forehead fiercely. This newly forged strategy launched them directly toward the oldest, wisest wolf in the entire kingdom. Following that spark of brilliant logic, Mara and Ronan found the secluded cave of the High Healer. The dim, rocky room smelled powerfully of dried lavender, crushed mint, and bitter black roots. Una, the blind head healer, sat quietly by a small, crackling fire. She was incredibly old, her gray fur patchy and her face covered in deep, ancient wrinkles. Because healers held a sacred, untouched rank in the feral pack, Una's word was treated as absolute law by every single elder. Mara sat down respectfully on the soft dirt floor across from the old woman. "High Healer," Mara began softly, choosing her words with extreme care. I caught a strange scent on Lyra today in the Great Hall. It was very sharp and very bitter. What does a fake pregnancy smell like? Una stopped grinding her herbs. She slowly turned her blind, milky eyes toward Mara. The heavy silence in the room grew incredibly thick, leaving a terrifying question hanging in the air. What exactly was Lyra hiding beneath those thick furs? Una smelled the herbs. She felt the bones. She knew the deep truth of the body. That scent should not be on a pregnant female, Una rasped quietly. Her voice sounded like dry, cracking leaves. There are certain rare herbs that can alter a wolf's scent. Some can even disturb the body's natural shape. But I would need to closely examine her before I accuse anyone of such a dark crime. Mara's heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She had confirmation that something was terribly wrong, but she still needed hard evidence. Because Mara needed absolute proof to satisfy the stubborn elders, this suspicion wasn't enough to condemn Lyra just yet. Ronan knelt down on the dirt floor beside Mara. His large hand rested gently on her lower back, a silent show of unbreakable support. He did not order the old woman with his harsh alpha command. He asked her with the deep, humble respect of a king seeking pure truth. Ona, Ronan said softly, I formally ask you to perform the sacred blessing ritual of the ancestors on Lyra at the morning gathering. For the ultimate safety of the realm. Una slowly nodded her gray head. She knew exactly what they were doing. She agreed to bring her skilled hands to the Great Hall at dawn. Armed with the healer's heavy promise, Mara prepared to spring the clever trap that would push the kingdom to its absolute limit. As the pale winter sun finally broke over the stronghold, Mara stepped bravely into the Great Hall. The massive room was already packed with hungry, noisy wolves. Lyra sat comfortably in a padded wooden chair near the central fire. She was eating rich roasted meat, acting exactly like a triumphant, untouchable queen. Mara walked right up to the center of the room. Ronan walked tall and broad right beside her, his terrifying presence demanding absolute silence. The elders completely stopped chewing their morning food. Elders of the council, Mara announced clearly, her voice ringing off the high stone walls. We have come to honor the sacred law. Since Lyra claims to carry the future king, she must receive the sacred healer's blessing for the ultimate safety of the pups. Una stepped slowly forward from the dark shadows. She carried a heavy clay bowl of crushed roots and holy water. Because Lyra had built her entire lie on everyone's fear of challenging a pregnant female, demanding a standard, mandatory healing ritual completely cornered her. If she refused the sacred blessing, she rejected the ancestors themselves. Lyra stood up quickly, her breath hitched. Her dark eyes darted around the room for a single second. But Lyra was incredibly intelligent. She did not scream. She did not throw a wild, guilty tantrum. She took a slow, deep breath and quickly regained her total control. She looked around the quiet hall, her face twisting into a mask of deep, tragic sadness. You want to examine me, because Mara simply cannot accept that the king fathered my children, Lyra said smoothly. Her voice dripped with fake pity. She wants to poke and prod me like a sick animal in front of the entire court to humiliate me. The room started turning against Mara again. The elders shifted uncomfortably, loudly whispering their disapproval. I will submit to the High Healer, Lyra continued, raising her chin proudly. But only under the ancient law of maternal privacy. I demand that Mara be completely removed from this hall. I will not let a jealous, bitter female watch my sacred blessing. Mara felt a cold rock drop in her stomach. Lyra had set a brilliant countertrap. Will the elders side with Lyra's demand for privacy, or will they force the examination in the light? If Mara agreed to leave, Lyra got privacy to hide her trick. If Mara refused, she looked like a jealous, fearful monster. Rising above the angry murmurs, a dry, cracking voice suddenly silenced the entire room. The Luna will stay, Una commanded sharply. Lyra whipped around, her confident smile completely vanishing. I am the High Healer, Una rasped, pointing a twisted, bony finger directly at Lyra's chest. I do not take orders from a claimant. The queen of this pack will stand right beside me while I touch your skin, or you will have no blessing at all. The sudden power shift in the room was completely deafening, setting the stage for a brutal, undeniable revelation. Following the High Healer's unyielding command, a suffocating silence dropped over the massive Great Hall. The roaring fire in the center pit seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of wild wolves watched with wide, nervous eyes as Una stepped slowly toward the trembling claimant. Lyra gripped her swollen belly, looking frantically toward the elders, but they refused to intervene. Because the healer's sacred word was absolute law, no one dared to stop Una from verifying the royal bloodline. Una reached out with her twisted, bony hands. She pressed her long fingers firmly against Lyra's stomach. The old woman did not shout a magical revelation. She simply frowned. Her fingers probed deeper, tracing the unnatural rigidity of the skin. "The swelling is hard," Una rasped, her blind eyes narrowing in deep concentration. "It is stretched tight like a cured hide, not yielding like a living womb. There is no warmth of life here." Lyra let out a sharp gasp and tried to twist away, but Una dipped her fingers into the heavy clay bowl of holy water. She wiped the liquid directly across Lyra's neck. The sweet, masking perfume washed away instantly. The sharp, incredibly bitter smell of the dark swamp root flooded the air. "She has chewed the bitter root to bloat her body," Una announced, turning to the council. "This is a false pregnancy." The great hall erupted in a wave of shocked, angry murmurs. But Lyra did not instantly transform into a mindless, attacking beast. She was vastly more cunning than that. She stumbled backward, pointing an accusing finger at the old woman. "She lies," Lyra screamed, her voice cracking with perfectly feigned desperation. "Mara paid her to say this. The queen wants my pups dead, and she has corrupted the high healer to do it. You all know I belonged in that royal tent." Elder Kenneth struck his staff against the stone. "Silence. The healer's word is sacred." "It was my right," Lyra shrieked, her mask completely slipping, as pure, venomous panic took over. She turned frantically to the whispering crowd, desperate to validate her claim to the throne. "I was the strongest female. I poured his mead that night. I fermented the berries myself so he would finally look at me, instead of that weak, human-loving coward. I took him into the heavy furs, and I tied the tent flaps back, so she would see exactly what she was losing. I orchestrated it all." The heavy words hung in the freezing air, echoing off the stone walls. Mara stopped breathing. The final, agonizing puzzle piece smoothly clicked into place. Lyra had just confessed to everything. She had intentionally intoxicated the king, manipulated his shattered senses, and staged the entire encounter. For 3 years, Mara had silently tortured herself, wondering if her mind had invented the betrayal. Now, she finally understood. She had not imagined anything. She really did see Lyra in those furs. She saw something entirely real. She simply hadn't known the poisonous truth behind it. The misunderstanding was completely, beautifully resolved. Realizing she had just proudly confessed to high treason in front of the entire kingdom, Lyra's eyes went completely wide with raw, bottomless terror. Trapped by her own arrogant confession, Lyra's terror instantly morphed into cornered, murderous rage. If she could not steal the royal crown with a clever trick, she would violently destroy the woman who had exposed her. With a deafening, unnatural crack of breaking bone, Lyra shifted. Her pale skin tore away, replaced by thick, muddy brown fur. The massive beast lunged straight at Mara, a blur of snapping jaws and desperate, lethal claws. For one terrifying heartbeat, Mara completely froze. The heavy beast was flying through the air toward her. The old, suffocating trauma spiked violently in Mara's chest. Her inner wolf was totally silent. The paralyzing fear of the last 3 years screamed at her to turn around, to run for the forest, to hide in the human world where fangs could not reach her. But Mara planted her bare feet firmly on the cold stone floor. She remembered the freezing nights in the city. She remembered the unbearable agony of running away. 3 years ago I ran, she thought, her brown eyes locking onto the incoming predator. This time, I am staying. In that exact moment of absolute, unyielding choice, her inner wolf finally answered. Her wolf had never been broken. It had not been killed by the trauma. It had simply been waiting for Mara to stop running. A brilliant, blinding flash of pure silver erupted in the center of the hall. Mara's bones shifted with fluid, painless grace. She did not shift to prove she was stronger than Lyra. She shifted because she finally, completely accepted herself. The massive, towering silver wolf met the brown beast in midair. Mara did not tear Lyra to pieces. She used her overwhelming size and absolute clarity to simply pin the treacherous female to the stone floor. Mara pressed her heavy silver paws against Lyra's chest, letting out a deep, earth-shaking rumble that demanded total submission. Lyra whimpered, dropping her tail and burying her neck in the dirt. Ronan had not stepped forward. He had not used his alpha command to save his mate. He stood back and let Mara face her own demon. Now, as Mara slowly shifted back into her human form, breathing heavily in the quiet hall, Ronan walked toward her. He did not shout a victorious boast. He stopped 2 paces away, slowly lowered his broad shoulders, and deeply bowed his head to his queen. The hall remained completely still. Then, from the shadows, the grizzled tracker Thorn stepped forward. He looked at the woman who had managed the winter food and exposed a traitor. Thorn slowly dropped to one knee and bowed his head. Elder Kenneth followed. Then the guards, then the rest of the pack. One by one, like falling leaves in a quiet forest, the entire kingdom lowered their heads to the woman who had stood her ground. Hours later, the heavy wooden door of the royal den clicked softly shut, leaving the chaotic world far outside. The roaring hearth fire cast warm, dancing shadows across the carved stone walls. Ronan and Mara stood quietly in the center of the room. The heavy scent of wild pine and fresh rain filled the air, but the frantic, desperate tension was completely gone. Ronan reached out, his large, rough hands gently cupping her face. "I am so entirely sorry," Ronan whispered, his voice thick with raw, bleeding emotion. "I let myself be blinded that night. I created the shadow that broke our lives. I should have protected our bond." Mara leaned into his warm palms. She looked up into his honest, golden eyes. "And I ran," Mara replied softly. "I saw the shadow, and I fled without asking a single question. Leaving was the only way I knew how to survive that kind of pain. But we cannot let silence decide our lives ever again." Ronan nodded slowly, his thumbs brushing away a single, stray tear from her cheek. No more running, no more silence. They did not need a wild, physically exhausting reunion to prove their love. They simply stood together, holding each other in the quiet warmth of the fire, carefully piecing their broken trust back together with soft words and undeniable honesty. Later that night, Mara stood alone on the high stone balcony. She wore a thick fur cloak against the freezing winter wind. She looked out over the massive, dark forest. Far in the distance, she could just barely see the faint, glowing yellow lights of the human city. She looked at those lights, but she did not feel any lingering bitterness. She realized with a profound, beautiful clarity that she did not hate the woman she had become in that city. The quiet, methodical barista was not a symbol of weakness. That human woman had learned how to read lies, how to manage survival, and how to think when the world was ending. The human city had given her the sharp mind that ultimately saved the kingdom, and her wild silver wolf had given her the immense courage to finally come home. She didn't have to choose between them anymore. She was the careful barista, and she was the feral Luna. She was both. Ronan stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his massive, warm arms securely around her waist from behind. He rested his chin gently on her shoulder. Mara leaned back against his solid chest, watching the bright silver moon rise high over their untamed kingdom, completely whole and finally at peace.